So I've been meaning to talk about tonight's topic for a long time, but I've been incredibly busy, and now I finally have some time to sit down and talk about tonight's topic, which is the Motte and Bailey fallacy. In this case, we're not talking about a literal Motte and a literal Bailey, but we're talking instead about the Motte and Bailey fallacy. So before we get started, what is the Motte and Bailey fallacy? Let's define our terms. The Motte and Bailey fallacy is the making of two separate and definitely different claims, using one as a shield for the other, and bouncing between the separate claims based on convenience, usually political convenience. So in this case, the claims don't necessarily need to be arguments because they could just be as simple as definitions. And they don't even necessarily need to be explicit. For example, somebody could say something means something, and then their actions indicate that it means something else when it's politically expedient. So this isn't an argument from principle, which is a huge part of why it's a fallacy. Instead, it's an argument from convenience, which is definitionally different from an argument from principle. So before we get into what it looks like in the real world and a more simplified version of what the Motte and Bailey fallacy is, we have to give a little tiny bit of a history lesson in terms of, and we're going to go back to medieval times to discuss a period of history I'm actually not that familiar with, so you'll have to forgive me, folks, as I've kind of dumbed this down quite a bit for everybody. So in medieval times, it was very common, in medieval Europe at least, to build a city in which at the center of the city is a fortified motte, so a fortress. And outside the fortified fortress outside the fortress walls, would be the rest of the community. This would be your bailey. So under normal circumstances, you'd conduct business out in the bailey. You'd conduct the commons out in the commons. In this case, when you had transactions taking place, when you had something that needed to go to market, when you needed to go buy something from the market, you'd go out into the bailey and you'd conduct your business. But then when you were faced with pushback from, let's say, invading forces, you would retreat to the motte and have that impenetrable defense, known as the motte, the fortress in this case, to hide behind. This is exactly the same thing in principle that's happening with the Motte and Bailey fallacy. In this case, when somebody presents an argument that contradicts the argument or the claim that you're making in the bailey, you will retreat to the motte and use an entirely different claim. So what does that look like in the real world? Well, the most obvious examples that come to mind are Black Lives Matter and Antifa. There is the literal concept of being in opposition, on principle at least, to the notion of fascism. There's also the literal notion that Black lives do matter. Except when we think of Antifa and we think of Black Lives Matter, when we see them actually engaging in the community, you probably think of this.
Protests started at about noon today in Seattle, but turned destructive right around 4 p.m. when someone lit a Seattle police cruiser on fire. Since then, we have seen widespread looting and destruction downtown.
We were changing batteries and a guy came over and kicked our microphone away and half broke it. We're actually watching this growing crowd trying to break into the T-Mobile back behind us, and I can hear glass. It sounds like they're making their way through.
Bottles.
Behind me is one of multiple locations that have been burning in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the course of the night.
So this is Black Lives Matter and Antifa engaging in the community. They're working in the bailey. So we can see from their actions what they actually mean by Antifa and Black Lives Matter. We can also see by their websites what they mean. And this is especially true when people refer to these groups with capital letters to begin them, to indicate proper nouns, such as the legally recognized and registered entity known as capital B Black, capital L Lives, capital M Matter, or things like Rose City Antifa. In this case, when somebody says, well, Antifa really look like this, the response we all get is, oh no, Antifa is just an idea. It doesn't exist.
Antifa is an idea, not an organization.
Oh, you gotta be
not
kidding.
malicious.
In this case, we're completely redefining their own definition based on what they've done in the Bailey, the implied definition that they're expressing in their actions in the Bailey. And instead, they're retreating to the Mott, which is the idea that, say, fascism is bad, which is a completely impenetrable wall. Nobody's ever going to disagree with that. However, this claim is completely belied by their actions. So why is the Motte and Bailey fallacy so bad? Well, for starters, and at the very least, there's always the element of deceit baked into the use of the Motte and Bailey fallacy. You're always going to be deceiving your audience as to your true motivations. Remember how I said that one claim is being used as a shield against the other? Well, we mean Black Lives Matter as in the literal idea of Black Lives Matter, but now we're going to build this website and register as a 501c3 and go out in March and pick it on the name and then Black Lives Matter and have this symbol, which is the fist in the air with your knee on the ground during the national anthem, or just the fist in the air and the knee in the ground as it has been pervaded into other areas and other arenas. And we're going to have all of that then culminate in these riots that have completely consumed certain cities across the U.S. for nearly an entire year. But all we really mean when we say Black Lives Matter, we don't mean that. We actually mean just the notion Black Lives Matter. So when you hear people chanting Black Lives Matter, which one do you think of? Do you think of burning, looting, rioting? Or do you think of the ethereal notion that Black Lives Matter? What happens when you offer the notion, correct, all lives matter, therefore Black Lives Matter? What happens when you offer the notion that lives matter, if you need a word in front of that, you're a racist? What's the pushback you're likely to get? Again, this is what you see when they act in the Bailey, and not when they have to retreat to the Mott. So in this case, we're presenting separate claims as the same. So there's always going to be that element of deceit. It's kind of reminiscent of the 1984 notion of doublethink, where you have the elimination of ideas by consuming these ideas into other words. But that's not really where this whole thing ends, because worse, Motte and Bailey fallacies tend to disguise evil with a shroud of virtue. And if you're not capable of seeing through the shroud of virtue, you're not going to see the true evil that lurks behind that shroud of virtue. What we have here is a cloak, a veil, that covers up an argument or a claim which could potentially be actually evil, in one that isn't necessarily not only not evil, it's one that, again, acts as a fortress. It is virtuous to say all lives matter. It is virtuous to say lives matter. From that, we can infer then that Black Lives Matter. So in this case, there is a shroud of virtue that covers up and covers for the actions of those who, under the flag of Black Lives Matter, destroy cities. And with this veil, these people who are not virtuous actors, who are actors of true evil, get a pass. So not only are we not able to see the evil that lurks behind the cloak of virtue, because we can't see it, we can't refute it, which means that evil is able to then pervade completely unencumbered. Real definition of words and phrases is a good thing. Insurrection should mean insurrection, not isolated, one-time, poorly organized, generic riot, in which the only person killed as a result thereof was an unarmed member of the rioting group. Racism should mean racism, not some definition which is both antithetical to that of racism, but which is itself racist. War should mean war, and not peace. But that speaks towards a broader conversation we'll have to have for another time. Basically, the lesson is say what you mean and stick to it. Act on principle, not out of convenience. That, folks, is the Motte and Bailey.